Snow fell in a slow, deliberate hush over the godswood, as if the world had decided to speak only in breath and silence. Jon stood beneath the heart tree where his father had brought him as a boy to learn that honor was a blade with two edges. The red leaves glistened with ice, their edges white where the frost caught them, and the carved face in the trunk looked down with the patience of an old and sorrowful king. Ghost pressed against Jon's leg, a pale shadow in the snow, ears pricked toward the deeper thickets beyond the pool. The direwolf's breath steamed on the air. Jon put his hand on the rough bark and told the gods what he could not tell anyone else. That the burn smell of King's Landing was still in his hair, that the screams worked their way into sleep and played out there until the first gray light cut them off, that he feared he would be called south once more, and that every time he looked at Winterfell's walls he felt like a boy pretending at being a man. "I never wanted any of it," he whispered, though he did not know whether he meant the fire in a dragon's eyes or the blood in his veins that had unmade his name. "But it keeps wanting me." The old face did not stir. Ghost huffed and nuzzled Jon's hand until he sank to his heels and rubbed the soft fur behind the beast's ear. Snow stuck to his black curls and his eyelashes. He stayed until his fingers grew numb even through the gloves, until he could hear footsteps creaking in the snow behind him and smelled the faint spice of clove oil Sansa used against the cold. "You never come to the hall when it's warm," Sansa said, her tone gentle and teasing at once. "You only love the places that hurt you." He stood. The white fur of her cloak caught the light like hoarfrost, and her auburn hair was bound with a strip of gray silk. She had their mother's poise now. No trace of the girl who had once dreamed of songs and shining lords. There was steel under every word she spoke, but the steel was not cruel. It held Winterfell together because it believed nothing worth holding could be held lightly. "A raven came from the south," she said, "from what's left of the Red Keep." Jon felt the cold move from the air into his chest. "Tyrion," she nodded. "He asks that we send a Stark to the council. The lords will gather. They want to choose a ruler," he says, "before the realm fractures again into a dozen petty wars. They'll have to clear the bones out of the dragon pit for chairs," Jon said, and heard the flatness in his voice. "Who do they name?" Sansa studied him with eyes that saw more than she allowed herself to say. "It's not a naming, a council, to choose. He asks for you if you can bear it. And if you will not come, he asks for me." Jon looked up into the red canopy. A crow hopped from branch to branch and sent down a small rain of ice. "You remember when we were children, and Father told us the pack survives?" Sansa's mouth quirked. "You remember it better than I do, if you quote him to me in his own godswood. It's one thing for a pack to survive a winter it's used to," Jon said. "Another to take the forest and all 7 rivers beyond it and call that surviving." "The North has not forgotten, Jon," Sansa said, and the softness fell away from her voice, though not the care. "We remember fighting for a southern crown. We remember what it cost us, and that the crown never remembered in return. The men who returned from the south brought back ash in their lungs and burnt towns where markets used to be. The girls came back with silence where their songs had been. I will not bend the knee of the North to another southern monarch, not for 1,000 fancy words about unity." "I'm not asking you," Jon said. "Neither is Tyrion." "No," Sansa agreed. "Tyrion is asking for a Stark. And I'm telling you this, if they make you king, you cannot be only a Stark, and you cannot only be a Targaryen. The North will not tolerate a dragon's chains. The South will not tolerate a wolf's cold. If you accept the call, if you ride south, you must decide what you are. Decide it and never lie about it again." "I never lied," Jon said, despite himself. "You hid," Sansa said, with no reproach in it. "I am not condemning you. I am telling you that hiding gave our enemies a map of how to hurt you. Do not give them more of you than you choose to give." He wanted to tell her that choice was the thing he was most afraid of. Instead he said, "I will go. If I do not, the lords will tear themselves to pieces arguing to hear their own voices. If I do not, the pack will be called to pick a side on a field we did not sow." Sansa exhaled, and he saw that she had expected him to say it and had still wanted him to refuse. "Then you will go," she said, "and I will hold the North." "A queen?" he asked, half a jest and half not. "A Stark," she said firmly. "The North will have no queen while you live. They would not accept it, and I will not press them. But I will be what our father was, with different tools. I will be the stone in the river that splits the current." Jon nodded. A wind cut through the trees and made the leaves whisper like voices in another room. He looked at the carved face one last time. The thoughts he could not shape into words he laid there, where roots drank secrets. Then he followed his sister through the snow to Winterfell's leaded doors, where the Iron Bannermen knocked their spear butts on the flagstones in a drumbeat of loyalty that had grown louder with every winter since the one that almost ended them all. He left 3 mornings later with a lean column of riders. Ghost padded at his stirrup, white fur startling against the dark horses. Ser Brienne rode to his right, a blue-cloaked mountain atop her gray destrier, Oathkeeper at her hip, and Ser Podrick Payne behind her, his eyes habitually scanning roofs and ditches. Ser Davos Seaworth, bundled against the cold as if it were a personal offense, spoke in quiet with the mandrel. Why Captain leading the supply wagons? They rode under a sky peeled thin by the knife edge of late winter, and the fields rolled by in strips of stubble and drifts. When they passed through the long wooden palisade of the moat, a boy with a horn of mended bone blew a low lament, and Jon watched the reeds shiver over ancient water that had seen kings long before anyone named Targaryen had learned to ride a dragon. At the Trident the ground turned brown and wet. The air softened. Ravens in scores rode the currents to whatever carrion the war had left them. The closer they came to King's Landing, the more the world stank of char. In places the snow lifted like a sheet pulled off a wounded man, revealing the raw meat of burned villages, the suck of mud where wells had collapsed, the ruins of coach houses and markers. Weary soldiers stood at crossroads with makeshift badges pinned on their cloaks to show what lord still commanded them, if any. Farms with survivors wore their losses like splints. Some came out to cheer. More stared with blank calculation, because a hungry man measures everything he sees by how many mouths it might feed. King's Landing rose like a black tooth left in a jaw. The sky over it smeared a darker shade, as if the air there had learned a gloom it would not give up. The outer walls still stood, stubborn and scorched. The gates were open, their heavy timbers scarred and new wood, and inside the streets bulged with carts and scaffolds. Men were cutting timber out of broken houses to make scaffolds to repair other broken houses. Davos set about arranging salvage crews before they had even passed the river gate. Brienne peeled off to visit the remnants of the city watch and check on food stores with a grim authority that made reluctant men become diligent. Tyrion was waiting in the wide court below the Red Keep's ruins. He looked smaller and very tired. His fine clothes had gone to practical cloth cut to fit, stained at cuffs and knees as if he had done some of the lifting himself. When he came to Jon, he bowed his head but kept his eyes, as if to say that he could be humble but would not be blind. "Your Grace," Tyrion said, as if the word itself might betray him. "I'm not that," Jon said. "You are many things you wish to deny," Tyrion replied. "I asked you because the city has begun to speak its own language of leaders. A man with a sword commands. A man with a book keeps the ledgers. A man with a hammer clears the stones. No one speaks for all. The last arrangement we had to solve that problem was a chair made of knives. A dragon solved the chair. We will need something better than knives now." They walked along the path the masons had hammered flat where the smashed steps lay like crooked teeth. The cliff face bore scorch marks that wind and rain had softened into tawny streaks. In places a skin of grass had dared to return. Jon looked over the city that he had helped condemn by doing nothing quickly enough to stop a woman he loved when she turned justice into fire. A few ships moved in the harbor, patched sails straining. The high hill where the September had stood was an open wound, braced by timbers. People had begun building a longhouse there, with a row of small shrines inside, one for each of the 7 and a strange pale corner with a twist of pale wood and a red rag for the old gods. Everywhere he looked were hands at work. He would have preferred the city as a ruin that time would take, but time was a slower healer than fear allowed. "The council?" Jon asked. "They come and go with the tides, and we have too few beds for them," Tyrion said. "Yara Greyjoy's ship arrived 2 days ago. She sleeps on her deck, which is more comfortable than anything we can offer. Lord Gendry Baratheon came with 3 blacksmiths, gave me a lecture on beam spans, and went to the forge before he saw his rooms. The Prince of Dorne sent a cousin with smooth sandals and rough words about Dornish patience. Lord Edmure has already apologized twice for that thing with the chair in the dragon pit. I told him he may apologize a 3rd time and no more. They made their way to the courtyard where stones had been cleared and a long table of planks set over trestles. Here were gathered those whose names still carried weight with men who had not yet starved or vanished home. Edmure Tully with a trimmed beard that made him look older and a humbler set to his shoulders. Robin Arryn grown too quickly, with Lord Yohn Royce always half a step behind him like a pillar with eyes. Gendry in a black and gold doublet that made his arms look like barrels. Yara with a short sword at her hip and a longer grin. A tall Dornishman with orange silk at his waist and a careful look around his mouth. A Hightower cousin whose ring had too many stones for Jon's liking. And others, some thin with struggle and some too well-fed for what their small folk had endured. Brienne stood straight as a rule with her hands linked behind her back. Davos leaned on the table as if it were the rail of a ship and he could make it answer by willing it. Samwell Tarly, in new maester's rings whose metal gleam still surprised him when he moved, was there too, fidgeting with the links as if they itched. He had the look of a man who wanted to write everything down and knew there would never be enough paper. Lord Snow, Edmure began, then stumbled. Lord Stark, perhaps. Forgive me. It is a habit. I mean to honor you. Jon is fine, Jon said. A council cannot crown a Jon, said the Hightower cousin, with a smile that did not touch his eyes. We are not in a tavern. We've been in worse, Yara said. Most rooms in this city count as taverns with less ale. You were asked here, Tyrion said, the warmth stripped from his voice. Asked, not summoned. We have no crown to summon with. The last crown went up like tinder, if you remember. We have to decide what that means. What it has always meant, Lord Yohn Royce said, iron in his mouth, that we are the heirs of the first men and the Undulls and the people who learned to throw nets along these coasts in the time before names. We keep the peace. We keep roads safe. We make judgments when judgments must be made. The peace, the Dornishman said smoothly, would be easier if the people who lit the last fire were not hailed as saviors. Jon felt the look and did not flinch. I did not hail any of it. I did not save any of it. I failed to stop her. Strong words for a man with dragon's blood, said Hightower with lazy malice. My blood is my mother's as well, Jon said. My name is Stark. A name, Hightower began. A name is a flag men can follow. Davos cut in. Let's not spit on flags when we need them. Sam cleared his throat softly. Forgive me, lords, ladies. We can talk about blood and names until we can weave a rope of it, but it won't tie a roof beam. Shall we speak of what must be done? We need food. We need a road from the Reach to King's Landing that wagons can keep to without being taken. The Riverlands need men in the field to break the last of the free companies who turned to banditry when they weren't paid. We need to decide whether we repair the Night's Watch or when, because even if the dead men do not return, there are living men beyond the wall who have learned the way south and may decide sometimes to come for what we will not share. The free folk are not raiders, Jon said, quietly but with the certainty of a man who had broken bread around their fires. They are people who look for warmth like the rest of us. They will keep to their side if we let them live on it without starving. If we do not, we will fight them until they learn to hate us more than they hunger. Brienne's eyes flicked toward him with respect. Yara scratched the line of a healed cut on her cheek. Sensible, she said. The sea taught me as much. Do we speak of repairs and food only? Hightower asked. Do we leave any matters of legitimacy to a better hour? Power must rest somewhere. We can pretend it's in the air between us as smoke, or we can put it in a hand that can be shaken and, if need be, guided or slapped. Choose your hand, then, Yara said, yawning. I'd like to know who I am meant to slap. Tyrion looked at Jon. Jon felt a silence expand inside him until it matched the rooms. He saw the dragon pit as it had been, crowded with lords while the small folk pressed against the walls to hear the men with titles decide their lives. He saw snow that wasn't snow flaking from a broken sky. He saw a young king who had died under a banner that promised more than he could deliver. A boy with a dream of a girl's smile at the end of a lance. A lord's daughter with winter in her blood holding her home in her bare hands. He thought of the way Sansa had said hiding was a kind of lie. He thought of the heart tree's blind patience. "I will not be king of knives," Jon said. "I will not sit a throne built to cut the man who sits it. If we choose a king now just to put a name to our need, we will feed that need again in a year or 5 or 10. If there is a king, he must be king because you ask him and because you will hold him to the asking. He must be chosen because he will use power to bind and not to burn." Hightower raised an eyebrow. "Fine words. If you would speak them from across, they would make a sermon." "They will make a crown," Tyrion said low. "If you let them." Gendry's big hands shifted on the table. "People need a name to curse and to bless. Without a name to point to, they will point to a friend they can reach and put him on a pike." "Who do you point to, my lord?" asked the Dornishman, voice like warm sand running through an hourglass. Gendry shrugged. "Not me. I can hammer a nail. I would marry a woman with sense and give her the keys and only ask for one room to put my anvil in. But the realm is a bigger house than Storm's End. We need a man with a face the winter doesn't scare and a heart that can look south and not be sick. You all know who that is." Jon almost shook his head, almost left the table and went to walk among workers whose names mattered because they had never been recorded. Then he remembered standing in a cave with a woman whose kiss had been snowmelt and flame both, and a tent full of men with hard laughs that softened around their children, and a night in a ruined hall where a man with cold blue eyes had reached for him. He had not run then. He had not run from her or from the dead. What was he running from now but himself? "If you ask me," Jon said, and his voice fell into the courtyard like a set iron. "If you choose me, I will serve. I will be a Stark and be a king if that is what keeps us from tearing each other into meat. I will do it under condition." "Ha!" Yara said, folding her arms. "No one enjoys a condition like a northerner. Let's hear it." "Not a condition for you," Jon said. "For me. I will not rule alone. I will not be the only voice in my own head. We will write a charter and nail it to the city so every man who can read will know and every man who can't can learn it from someone who can. The lords of each kingdom will have their rights written and the small folk theirs. The faith will be honored and so will the old gods. The king will lead men in war and keep the peace at home, but taxes will be set by a council of lords and commons both. When it is time for succession, we will call the lords to a seat, and great men and women will swear to the one who wears the crown. No more births in secret that bind men who never agreed to be bound. If I do not have a child fit to rule, or if I choose never to have one, the realm will choose who follows me. Not blood alone. Worth." Sam's mouth almost fell open. Tyrion looked as if he had bitten into something that tasted better than he had expected. Davos grunted approval. Hightower's hand tightened on his ring. "You will put a charter above the will of the crown?" Hightower said, finding his smile again and making it a knife. "You will put writing above blood? That is a Reachman's trick, to be sure." "It is a man's trick," Davos said. "And a woman's too, if you've ever met one with sense." "I've met more than a few." "If the lords agree," Yohn said, "and if the small folk hear and can hold their lords to it, then what you describe is not a trick. It is a wall. We have put our trust in bad walls before. This one we will build with oaths a man can't knock over with fire." "One problem," Yara said, and looked mischievously pleased to say it. "You have to be king first to take away your own power. You cannot pluck feathers off a bird that flies away." Edmure shifted as if a net had been drawn under him. "Then let's choose," he said quietly. "I've done enough talking in rooms like this. Lord Jon, you saved us from the snow that walked. You bled for us when the South asked you to help behead your own heart. If you promise what you've said, I choose you." The nods came, as nods do, a few brave first, then many that looked less brave and more like acceptance, and a few grudging. Yara shrugged and made the blunt sign of consent with her chin. Gendry thumped the table once. The Dornishman lifted his hand with deliberation, as if he wanted to show the movement was his, not anyone else's. Hightower did not smile now, but he did not dissent. He looked away as a man does when the wind on the Mander turns against him, and he pretends he had always wanted to sail this course. "Then I am your king," Jon said, and the words brought no fire with them. They did not taste of victory. They tasted like cold bread eaten quickly so that others could eat. "I swear my life and my honor to this charter. If I break it, may the gods break me." Tyrion let out the breath he had been holding. Sam put his hand before his mouth to hide the little boy's grin that he could not keep away. Davos looked at the sky as if he expected to see a sign and was relieved when there wasn't one. Brienne fell to one knee, eyes bright and fierce. All around, the lords and ladies bent, some with ornate formality, some awkward as if their joints protested, and some with grace like water. Jon did not ask it of them. He bowed his head to them in return, to make the thing a trade and not a taking. They made a first show of it on the hill where the September had been. Carpenters raised a frame draped in winter cloth dyed blue and white. The new High Septon, chosen in a meeting of tired priests in a ruined back room of a temple in the Street of Silk, as if holiness could grow from broken places, came in his plain linen, and the old gods were represented by a branch brought from Winterfell's godswood, its leaves reddening in a basin of melted snow. The small folk gathered in their hundreds, not because they loved any sovereign but because they loved watching someone put order to a thing. Jon stood in plain mourner's black without a crown. He had asked for one not to be forged until the charter was, and the absence of a circlet seemed to calm something in the crowd. Tyrion spoke the words of the charter as each clause was proposed and agreed, and Sam, tremble-handed and proud, wrote them neatly on a parchment pinned to a plank so the wind could not steal it. When the High Septon nodded and spoke the Seven's blessing and the old branch was dipped in the water and the drops flecked Jon's brow, there was no roar. There was a hush, and then a sound like the sea relief mostly, and the murmur of hungry pragmatism that believed this might help the stewpot more than screaming wood. That night Jon sat with Tyrion in a chamber whose roof had been mended against the rain and watched Brienne drill 100 half-trained guardsmen in the yard with Ser Podrick at her side. She moved like a door on perfect hinges, her blade precise. The lanterns swung in the wind. The city smelled less of ash and more of wet stone. "You're a Stark who took the south with words," Tyrion said, pouring wine. "Somewhere, Tywin is gnawing on his own bones in frustrated admiration." "Don't," Jon said, a small smile confronting the ridiculous image and letting it pass. "Very well," Tyrion said with mock solemnity. "We have a list as long as my arm of what to do next, and both of my arms are short. Food first. Davos has carts on the road and boats at sea. But the Reach will never forgive a northern king if we gratefully accept their grain and forget to send gold. Talk to Sam, Grand Maester Samwell, my apologies. He knows what the Citadel's ledgers look like. We will need coin with less history attached to it than a Lannister's." "I do not need to be told it's complicated," Jon said, weary and wry. "Complicated is the thing the world is when it does not want you to sleep." "Oh," Tyrion said, "and one more thing. They will ask you to marry." The word felt like a trap sprung. "They can ask. They will do more than ask," Tyrion said. "You think by saying no you keep the reins in your own hand, but refusing marriage does not remove marriage from the table. It invites alliances to plot around you. It's a game of chairs. If you refuse to sit, you will find a dozen bottoms in the seat before you can blink, and then a dozen more brawling over who sits on which knee. I won't get a child only to make a tool," Jon said, the old shame rising. "I won't tie a woman to a spring I might snap in two. I won't do to someone what was done to my father and mother." "You could also marry for love," Tyrion said dryly, "though I hear that ends badly." Jon did not answer. They drank, and the wine sat in his stomach like something he had to apologize for. In the weeks that followed he became what he had promised. More clerk than conqueror, more judge than any kind of king he had seen before. He spent his mornings hearing small cases. A baker whose oven had been used by soldiers and never paid for. A butcher who had lost his stall to a nobleman's rent call. Lecter when the city burned. A girl who wanted her brother found before the river or a brothel took him. In the afternoons, he met with lords who had decided humility was a fashionable cloak and wore it badly. He read reports by candlelight until words turned to blotches and his mind filled them with wolves. He ate sparingly, which made his cooks despair. He slept as if he might owe the night money. He spent time in the yard with Ghost, going through the motions of care because Ghost did not understand oaths, only touch. Sansa's letters came north, neat and stern and full of information wrapped in affection. She wrote of harvest yields and teeth of young wolves and disagreements among bannermen about how to tax a winter that had taken too much. She sent counsel when he asked, and when he did not, and he took that counsel as a man drinks water after long work. Arya's raven came once, a scrap of a note more than a letter, with a crude sketch of a ship and a line. "I'm not done with maps yet." When he showed it to Gendry, the big man laughed, a sound full of loss and fondness. Brienne's reports were practical and pleased. She had her Kingsguard at last. 6 sworn so far, with spots open to be filled only when she found men or women she trusted with her own name. Ser Podrick was among them. Ser Illafer, once a mercenary, gave up his coin hankering for an oath. A tall arbor girl, Leona, fought like a storm among young men and did not apologize. The 7th spot, Brienne said, was kept for the one she had not yet found, and Jon knew that meant not an expertise of the sword but of the heart. Davos went to sea, hauling grain and salt fish, bringing back barrels of olive oil and sacks of barley. He returned with gossip too, as every good captain does. In the Riverlands, some free companies had turned to exacting tolls. Davos had arranged to hire some to fight the others and then dissolve like foam. In the Westerlands, a bank in Lannisport had begun minting coins with a wolf's head where a lion's would have been. Tyrion did not know whether to be offended or to clap. In the Reach, old houses met behind new closed doors. It took less than a season for the trouble in the Reach to show its face. It came as a hiss first, then as a voice, Uther Hightower's voice, the cousin with too many stones. He was clever enough not to bring the charge himself. Priests of the 7 with long faces and louder mouths said that a king without a prayer at his coronation must, at the least, bend a knee in the great September when it is rebuilt, that the 7 would not bless a crown that had been touched by forest gods. Lords who had lost sons in a northern winter spoke with bitterness about a crown that wore fur and left them to count their roses under frost. Fossaways, some green apple and some red, argued apple logic at table until it became politics. Hightower ships began to collect more duties from boats crossing the Whispering Sound than they charged their own. It was not rebellion. It was reach. Tyrion read a letter and drummed his fingers. The Prince of Dorne writes that the Hightowers have a plan, and Dornishmen say it as if they think plans are vulgar. When a Dornishman tells me someone else has a plan, I become nervous. "What would you have me do?" Jon asked. "Visit," Tyrion said. "Kings do not only sit. They make their faces familiar to men who have only heard their names cursed. And bring Sam." Oldtown finds it hard to look at him and remember that he is not a boy who once dropped a book on his head in a tower room. "And soldiers?" Brienne asked. "A few," Tyrion said. "Enough to show you trust the peace." Jon went south again. This time the wagons held wine and gifts and men with clean cloaks, musicians who knew both northern reels and Reach harvest songs. The road along the Mander was already better. Gendry's lecture on beams had turned into people who knew how to build them. The floodplains were wet with winter's last weeping. The reeds swayed with unseen life. Oldtown rose like a great dream of stone from the horizon, the Hightower's beacon unlit in the day, the starry September's broken dome repaired with new slate. They were met at the gate by a procession so fine Jon wished it had been a fraction less. Uther Hightower walked under a parasol held by a page, smiling like a man at his own wedding. The new High Septon was there too, a thin, aging man with eyes that wanted to be kind and hands that wanted to be clean. Sam's face resembled a boy's caught with jam on his fingers. He bowed and murmured at the maesters who came out in their rings to greet him, some with genuine warmth, others with concealed amusement. "Your Majesty," Uther said, bowing perfectly, "Oldtown is honored. We are a city that prefers light to heat." And this? He swept an arm to indicate the clean streets, the dockyards busy with long boats. This is a place built in layers. The newest must respect the oldest, or the whole will not stand. A man who thinks of layers should not try to count the sky from the roof. Davos muttered near Jon's ear, and Jon choked a smile back. My lord, Jon said, and offered his hand. I came to make peace and barter, and not to count your saints. The reach is wide enough for a king's mercy and a lord's pride. Uther laughed. Mercy in a northern mouth. Very well. We will speak of trade, your majesty, and we will speak of borders. Words cool tempers, but not all tempers. That night in the Hightower, during a feast that managed to be both generous and thin, a young priest with pale eyes stood on a bench and declared in a voice that shook with fear and desire that a king who would not swear by the Seven would drag the realm into winter again. He called Jon a ghost with no blessing in him. The company murmured discomfort. The priest looked toward Uther as if for rescue and saw approval in the angle of his lord's jaw. Before Jon could answer, Sam stood. My lords, Sam said, and he looked not at the prize. Tea but at the people, the cooks in the doorways, the half-drunk page with the parasol, the women who poured wine, the overseer of the harbor with a little silver tower on his cap. When the dead came, they didn't stop to ask which god we served. They didn't stop to ask for the name of our headman. They didn't ask about laws. They ate men. When they came, this man fought until he bled his life into the snow to hold them. He swore to protect the living. Now he swears to protect your rules and your roads and your harvests when the harvest comes. You may choose not to like him. You may choose to set him rules. That is wise. But do not pretend that you can live on disdain. The dead did not give you that luxury. If he fails you, you will see it soon enough, for failure in such a time as this is a loud thing. You will not need a priest to interpret it for you. The murmurs turned. Some smiled. Others looked abashed. And one or two glared at Sam as if they had found a fly in their soup. Uther raised his cup, bowing his head just enough. We will not starve your wagons on their way back, he said, with lightness like a cat's step. See? Words. The words held it together longer than Jon expected. There were oaths sworn in Old Town. The Citadel's shelves offered bellies grain that had been kept for famine. Hightower ships brought oil and wine north. In return, the crown made concessions to the Reach. Fees on wool that favored weavers in Highgarden's shadow, salt rights given along the Mander. The High Septon blessed a compromise script Jon had written with Sam and Tyrion that allowed kings to swear by gods of their fathers while promising to honor the faith's rights. It was a fabric made of many colored threads. He sensed it would tear, but it would do until they could weave something stronger. The tear came not as treason but as smoke. Old Town's beacon went up in a sudden blaze that was not the pure white of whale oil, but the sick green of something that had haunted the city once before. A wind off the whispering sound carried the news to Jon as he inspected a granary. He mounted without thinking and rode with Brienne and a dozen knights to the tower, where men scrambled like mice inside a drum and the green flames licked at the crown of the stone and hissed like 1,000 snakes. Wildfire? Brienne said, drawing back as the heat hit like a hammer. Gods! How? Stored in vaults? Said a Hightower clerk, wringing his hands. Old Cassius the pyromancers left in the city when words ran out for him, and he looked grateful to see a bucket line to join and fled. Who would light it? Davos asked, eyes narrowed to slits. Wildfire is a candle you don't put out. A boy came running, throwing himself to his knees before Jon because people do that around kings when their feet cannot find another way to stop. Men in brown, he gasped. No, not men. Boys like me, my lord. No, your grace, robes, blue scarves. All saying a prayer and then running. They said the light of the seven would. Brienne was already turning, voice cutting across panic. Put water lines on the north and west where the wind pushes. Pull away anything that can carry fire, tar, rope, oil. You, she pointed at Davos. Ships in the harbor. Flood the lower tower if you can, or at least the outer ring. Davos nodded. We'll drown hell if we have to. The green fire ate its way down from the top, and the light in the day was like a bruise. Men fell and were tossed into nets hauled taut across alleys to keep them from breaking. Others came up coughing and burned, their robes that of the faith. John hauled bucket after bucket because he could do it. The rhythm of water and ash stole thought from him. When he could barely stand, Davos came back drenched to his waist, and the fire was choking itself on char. Men turned away, mouths covered, eyes leaking, to count those who had fallen. Uther Hightower arrived late, looking appropriately shocked and distressed. He wrung his hands like the clerk had and spoke quickly of apologies and investigations and the evil that had lived long in the city's stone. He had a list ready of the young men who had been seen near the tower. It seemed to John that it was too ready. Blood welling under the heat broke and ran in his mouth. He tasted iron and anger. "Arrest them," John said, "not as a king who hates the faith, as a king who hates killing innocents. If we burn Old Town, it will be our fire next time. Find the men who gave them the order." Uther's smile did not reach his eyes again. "You will find fools, your grace. Young men with more zeal than sense. These things happen. They happen less when lords do not whisper into their ears," Tyrion said, appearing at John's shoulder, soot-smudged. "I know about whispering. You are not the first man to think a pious riot is a lever you can pull and release." "We will investigate," Uther said. Together, they did. They found boys whose knees knocked in their rough-spun robes and who spoke of cleansing and light with cloudy eyes. They found a cellar with scorch marks and a mason's apron smeared with oil. They found nothing that could tie Uther to it with a cord that would hold in a court of law. The High Septon wept, and John did not think the tears were false. The beacon was rebuilt with oil from the crown's stores, and when it was lit again it burned the old white and called ships safe home. John left Old Town with the feeling he had put a board across a chasm and asked a caravan to trust it. The problem with governing men is that they are not a single problem. While John watched a tower burn, bandits took a stretch of the Rose Road and began to levy their own crown with knives. While Tyrion wrote a charter for tolls so that wagons could move without paying a tax every mile, the Prince of Dorne sent a letter saying he would no longer accept a Hightower tariff on salt unless the Hightowers accepted a Dornish tariff on wine. While Brienne beat a boy's sword out of his hand and taught him to pick it up again properly, the Ironborn noticed fat boats moving down the coast and wondered whether their vows to a Queen of Ashes were debt to a King of Snow. Yara came to him in the small hours, smelling of salt and tar, her dark hair a wind tangle. "My men hear whispers," she said without preamble. "Not from me, not from my captains. From boys who left their islands when Euron made slaughter into sport and have not yet learned that there are different ways to live. They call themselves Drowned Sons, which is a name a man gives himself when he does not yet know what the sea takes." "What do they want?" John asked. "To prove that the sea is stronger than oaths," Yara said. "To take their longships out with hooks drooping from the rails like fishing birds and come back with longer boats than they set out with. To be told afterward that they are men." "Who leads them?" Yara's mouth twisted. "A priest who thinks the drowned god gave him a voice. He took it up when my uncle made a mockery of religion by wearing it like a cloak. The boy calls himself Tristan Pike. His real name's not worth learning. He plays at drowning boys on beaches and brings them up gasping to tell them he owns their lungs." John stood, moving to the map spread on the table. He traced the jagged line of coasts with a fingertip. "Where?" "North of Fair Isle the sea goes mean," Yara said. "They wait there. That's where the fat boats go slower and the escorts think a green and pleasant reach doesn't have a bite." "Davos," John said. "I'm not sleeping," Davos said from the window, where he had been looking at the night like a man who meant to interrogate it. "I can run the Mander without bumping my elbow on another ship's mast." "Take ships," John said. "Send signals to any escort. Don't engage unless you must. If you must, end it clean. Prisoners over corpses. If they'll listen, offer them a way to be men that does not involve drowning anyone. If they won't, do what the sea makes you do." Brienne stared at the map. "I would go by land to the Rose Road," she said. "I do not like leaving bandits to learn that crowns do not watch roads. Podrick will take half the guard." We will break their toll and hang only those who don't understand mercy after the first time it is offered. Take it, Jon said. Pod, if you get yourself killed, I will have to find another squire, and no one else has learned when to bring me a drink and when to bring me a silence. Yes, your grace, Podrick said, with a ghost of a grin. They moved. The court in King's Landing became a lighthouse that shone while ships left it and wagons rolled out and returned weeks later with news like fish. Some sleek and silver, some spiny, some that stank but were important to pull anyway. Davos found the drowned sons and talked before he tasted blood. He promised the boys iron wreckwood and pay under Yara's flags and not oblivion under a wave. Some listened, blessed them, and others did not. The sea took what it always does. Brienne cut the knot of the Rose Road bandits without knotting herself. She left men hanging who had forced themselves to love brutality because they thought it made them kings. She spared the ones who had joined out of hunger. She left a unit of crown soldiers to live in a makeshift fort and hold the road. If Jon wondered what he had become, no one would say. But he could tell from the way the small folk began to look at him with a practical sort of attention that he had become something useful, and that was more than he had hoped. They brought him petitions tied up in old ribbons and children to pardon and toothaches to solve. He opened the city stores to mothers in a cold snap and had a letter read aloud in the square explaining how much there was, how much could be given and still leave enough for hunger to have an end. A woman came to him with an onion and asked him to bless it. He had done so with solemnity and then sent her to Davos, who blessed it with a good stew. Trouble in the Westerlands came next, as if all the old wrongs wanted their turn to test him. Lannisport hardened when a rumor spread that Tyrion would restore the old practice of royal officers levying fines for seditious speech. Tyrion had said nothing of the kind. He had written instead a clause in the charter that made seditious speech a matter for the courts instead of the headsman, with the punishment of fine and service to the city for those who could not pay. Men who wanted to gather and shout did not always enjoy being guided to legal shouting instead of dramatic arrests. Tyrion took a ship to Lannisport with a guard of men wearing neither lion nor wolf on their sleeves and spoke in the market while merchants sold turnips at his feet. "I was born in this city," he said to the crowd. "I drank my first sly taste of wine behind the second fountain, though my father would have me hanged for saying so. I have been called traitor here and murderer, savior and villain. I do not envy you the job of figuring out which of those names fits me today. But I will tell you this. I would rather you call me traitor in public and go home to your wives than watch one more boy with a rope around his neck to show that the crown is strong. The crown will be stronger if you are not afraid of it. There are lords who will hate me for this. I hate me a little for this. But listen, being allowed to shout makes shouting less fun. You will find yourselves arguing about the price of eels instead. And I promise you, as a man who has been many things, that this is a better life." He came back breathing a touch easier, though he drank more that night than Jon liked him to. Jon listened and nodded and did not lecture him, because he was not a god and men without vices are made of wood. Two things kept Jon's nights from drowning together. One was Ghost, who nudged him awake when what he dreamed threatened to become a shout. The other was Bran. Bran came to King's Landing as summer tried to push a corner of itself into spring. He arrived without fanfare in a light cart with 2 horses and Mira Reed walking beside it, brown hair wild as marsh grass, spear over her shoulder. Bran's face had gone more distant in the years since Jon had last seen him. He could be a boy when Mira said something that pleased him. When he looked at the heart tree branch Jon had kept in water, he was something else. "They wanted to make me a king," he said. When Jon embraced him and felt the smallness of Bran's shoulder blades under his cloak, "I said no." Tyrion said yes for me, but only because he thought it made sense. He's not wrong, but sense is not the same as truth. The truth is that I am not made to keep ledgers or listen to fishermen argue about nets. The truth is I see too many things that are not nets. Jon put a hand on the back of Bran's neck. "I'm sorry for all of it." Bran blinked slowly. "I am not sorry," he said. "I was a boy who was pushed from a tower, and it made me into a kind of window. Windows are useful. I came to see you because a rook told me a story in its rook way that something at sea was changing. And because I wanted to see where you put a tree in a city that was built to have none." Mira gave John a smile that knocked years off the weight that had settled on his shoulders. "We saw your charter," she said. "It's a good piece of work." "Sam wrote most of it," John said. "Sam always was better with quills than knives," Mira said. "It is no shame to have a weapon and not use it if you have other ones that cut cleaner." They talked in muffled rooms and the shade of scaffolds. Bran told John that the free folk had found a valley beyond the broken place where the wall's shadow lay, and that Tormund had already built a hall out of bones of trees. He told John that the last of the whites had wandered until their fingers broke like straw and then fallen, becoming nothing but stories to frighten children with for generations. He told John, quiet as a falling leaf, that he had seen a dragon fly west from the ruins of a city that men called a different name when the world was younger, and that when the dragon landed it had slept a dream of hunger. John closed his eyes. "Drogon." "He knew you were not his enemy," Bran said. "He knew it when he took her away. He knew that something had to change or you would change it." "Will he return?" John asked. "Sometimes birds tell me that a shadow passes over the sea and the fish dive deep," Bran said. "That could be a dragon, could be a story. Stories like to be dragons. I do not think he will come to a city easily. I think he will come when it is dark." They sat in the courtyard at dusk and watched Ghost test the boundary between dog and ghost. Mira told John what the marsh smelled like when the wind blew from the south. Bran closed his eyes and smiled at something John could not see. The city at night was a generous darkness that let him rest for a while. The news of the Reach tearing itself came like a crack in a chest. It arrived in the form of 3 letters on the same day, one to John, one to Tyrion, one to Sam. Each was in a different hand. They all said the same thing. The Lords Declarant of the Mandor had declared that they would recognize the King's Charter if and only if the King swore it in the starry September and took a wife of the Reach, a marriage that would produce heirs that could be taught that the sun rises in Oldtown. They wrote it more politely than that. They wrote it with words that smelled of honey and had little stings hidden in them. "Who signs this?" John asked, though the names were plain enough. Hightower, Rowan, Redgapple Fossaway and Greenapple Fossaway both, Oakhart, Tarly's cousin who had inherited what remained of Hornhill's pride. Beesbury, but Beesbury always signed things without knowing why. A Florent with forgiveness in his pen and calculation in his heart. Not all of the Reach, never all, but enough to vex any king. Tyrion rubbed his eyes. "They want to marry you to a girl who knows how to name every flower in the Citadel's gardens. They want to wake up in 5 years and say, 'The king is friendly to our bread and our wine because his wife likes our songbirds.' It is an old tactic. It works more often than one would like." "I will not," John said. "I told you I would not." "Yes," Tyrion said. "And I told you that refusing does not remove the pieces from the board. It means other hands push them." Sam read the letter and thought for a long minute before he spoke. "They could be worse," he said finally. "They could ask you to kneel. They could ask for the North to send hostages to Oldtown. They ask for ceremony and a show of kinship. The marriage, they are trying to bind you to their quarrels with a bed. But the other clause, we can give them what they ask in another form. Bring them a ceremony. Not the starry September, no. We build a small house of worship on the hill and swear there by both the Seven and the old gods. And we invite the small folk to serve the bread and pour the wine." Uther's reply arrived with a sweetness that made John want to spit. He agreed to the ceremony with a grace that made it seem as if the idea had been his. He put off the marriage proposal with a little-mouthed observation that men who had refused to marry could not be forced. He added, with cunning, that where a king left a crown seedless, the nobles must plant around him to ensure a tree. Hightower meant that he would set the Reach to filling John's court with cousins until John had a garden of them. "We will invite fewer cousins," Tyrion said, and smiled without mirth. "Brienne, I think the garden will need a wall." They built the little hall in a month, which seemed like a miracle until John watched the carpenters and realized they were calling in favors from the gods of a different sort. Habit, practice, pride. The place had 7 niches and a long piece of pale wood as an altar. Tea the center, in a low bowl, Sam set a cutting from the Winterfell godswood, new leaves peeking as if undecided. They brought water from the Blackwater in ewers and set loaves baked in the shape of grain sheaves. The High Septon came in grey, and the old gods came in silence. Lords came in heraldry that looked as if it had been waiting for a war that didn't happen. Jon swore again. He did it with both hands on the altar and his eyes on the bowl where the cutting trembled in a draught. He promised to rule by the charter and to keep the peace and to fight if fighting must come and to spare if sparing was possible. He did not say the words beautifully. He said them as if they cost him breath, which they did. The folk crowded the doors and watched him and then looked at one another, and in their looking Jon saw a possibility he would not name yet, that they might begin to think of the crown as something that listened before it spoke. They did not have the luxury of letting that possibility grow. The Lord's declarant brought soldiers, as men who fear their own luck always do. They did not declare war. They declared security. They moved into villages near the Mander and put their banners over market stalls. They inspected boats on the sea and found taxes missing even when taxes had been paid. They sent envoys to Storm's End with reasons why a Baratheon would be better off with a Reachman laughing at his table than a northern wolf counting his barley. Gendry sent them away with a hard smile and a promise that his hammer could still fix a mouth that lied. Yara sent word that Hightower ships had begun stopping Ironborn at the mouth of the Mander and demanding fees for the privilege of breathing. "You are being tested," Tyrion said in the council chamber, which had a new table and mismatched chairs that Jon liked because they were what they were and did not pretend. "It is a child's test, and I apologize to any clever children for saying so. They poke and see whether we poke back. We must, not with heads on spikes, with law, with a line, with a show of force that ends with fewer corpses than one would think." "Where?" Brienne asked. "Highgarden," Tyrion said, the word falling like a smooth stone into water. "They have gathered the lords there to drink and discuss and pass notes to one another that smell of beeswax. They will send messengers to Old Town from those tables. They will send soldiers to the villages from those beds. We will send a letter saying the king comes to audit his own taxes, which is a dull way to say what I really mean." "And what do you mean?" Jon asked. "That we must take their hearth away from them," Tyrion said, suddenly weary. "They are sitting around fires telling one another stories about wolves that cannot cross the neck without drowning. We will go in and sit down and drink their wine and count their spoons and tell them gently that the hearth is ours." It took less than a fortnight for the court to become an army. Not large, Jon would not bring a host that would look like invasion, but particular. Northern spearmen whose eyes made men think twice about doing something stupid. Knights from the Vale under Jon Royce, heavy and proud. Riverland archers with the look of men who had learned patience the hard way. Yara brought 5 longships to stand politely at the Mander's mouth and stop counting at a number she would choose. Davos took the riverboats. Brienne commanded the foot. Tyrion brought his maps and a face that practiced calm like prayer. They marched through the Reach in the soft rain that makes flowers look smug. Highgarden rose improbably ahead, its towers like a dream of what masonry might do if it wanted to show off. Each terrace spilling roses down green walls. Somewhere in those gardens a girl could still sing, but the song would be thinner now. The gates were open, because to close them would admit guilt, and Uther stood on the great stair with a cup of pale wine and a smile that would have looked gracious if it were not on his face. "Your Majesty," he said, perfect again. "Welcome. The last king to visit Highgarden took our bread and left fire. We were hoping for better luck with you." "You may find it," Jon said. "Bread is a thing I am fond of." They camped on the lower ground by the river, in sight of the walls, putting tents up in straight lines because order matters when men panic. Jon rode into the great hall with Brienne and Tyrion and a dozen guards whose faces did not change when their eyes did. The Lords Declarant were in a temperate mood, which is to say that the wine had not yet loosened their tongues into saying what they meant. Jon did not speak of oaths or fire. He asked for ledgers. It was an insult that appeared polite. Uther had to fetch them. Lord Rowan bristled in a way that made Tyrion write his name down on a piece of paper and draw a circle around it. Beesbury protested about the security of the keys and produced 3 by mistake. Jon sat at a long table and turned page after page, asking questions that were small knives. He was not good at numbers, but he had Sam by his side, and Sam was. They asked where the grain that had been bought for starving villages had gone, and why the tally stones showed 3 wagons leaving for every 2 recorded carts. They asked why farmers were being charged the same tariff for bringing apples to market as merchants paid for bringing olive oil from Essos. They asked why 3 ships registered to cousins of Uther Hightower had managed to make it up the Mander without paying at the mouth. It was exhausting, dull, infuriating, and it made the Lords Declarant into something they had not expected to be: embarrassed. They had come prepared to answer charges of treason and to decry the wolf at their door. They had not prepared for a man to ask them why their bookkeepers had smudged lines to hide small thefts. When, at last, Uther's smile cracked, it was like seeing a minnow's reflection cut by A.S. "Tone, this is beneath your crown," he said. "Counting barley? It is what my crown is for," John said. "The largest wars begin because men think they are too important to count barley. My father died because a man thought he could keep bleeding the city without anyone minding the ledger. The dead came because men did not believe that the small untrue thing could become a larger one. No more. Not while I breathe." Uther's next movement was the movement of a man who has decided smiles have failed. He leaned forward. "What you are is a northerner calling himself king, come to teach us how to store our own grain. You mistake this hall for a stable, your majesty. You mistake my patience for weakness. You think that coming here with noble talk will make the Reach forget why we agreed to a Targaryen first. Because dragons do not ask for permission." John stood. Brienne's gauntlet hand slid toward the hilt of her sword, and then away, because this was not a moment for drawn steel. Tyrion's quill scratched, the sound of a raven's foot on slate. Outside the hall, rain whispered against roses. "I did not come to ask permission," John said. "I came to tell you this. The roads will run without your tolls. The wheat will move without your books. You may gather your taxes according to the charter, and the charter will be read aloud in every marketplace from here to Old Town until every child can recite the parts that matter to his dinner. Hightower ships will pay at the mouth like any other. If your men stop wagons, my soldiers will start them again. If you move to stop my soldiers, I will move to stop your men. And if we come to blows here, in this hall, we will both make liars of ourselves before the small folk, and they will remember exactly which lords made the first corpse." For a moment John thought Uther would pull the hall down with the muscle in his jaw. Then he smiled again, and the smile was a bandage that did not cover the wound. "You will need a husband," he said. "King of words. I need enough bread for your people and mine," John said. "The rest we can argue when the knives are put away. If all else fails, we will let the women in your kitchens decide. They are better rulers than most of the men at this table." The laughter that followed was thin and resentful, and yet there was laughter, and laughter can pour water on sparks. They left the hall with no blood on the floor, which is sometimes the best kind of victory a man can expect. They had their war anyway, not from Highgarden but from smaller places where men had less to lose and more to prove. Lord Rowan's nephew, eager and ignorant, raised men from the hill villages and rode them into the Crown's camp in an early morning fog, thinking to capture a king and write himself into songs. He found, instead, Podrick and a dozen of Brienne's guard already on their feet at the first cry of a nervous horse, and he discovered that songs rarely describe what a fight inside a camp smells like. Brienne moved through the confusion like a wind that had decided to be a sword. She took the boy off his horse without cutting him open, then held him down with a foot on his chest until he stopped struggling with tears and snot all over his face. John rode out from his tent with Ghost at his heel, called for the attackers to stand down, and stopped the men who wanted to cut a throat for honor by saying, simply, "If you cut him, I'll have to explain him to his mother and I don't have time." The boy was 15. He looked it when someone wiped the mud off his face. He told John that he had ridden to be a man. John told him to be a boy while he could and sent him to the kitchens to wash pots until he remembered he liked to sleep. This sort of thing makes a war horrible for men who plan them and satisfying for those who fund them. You can buy a war in sacks of grain and send a nephew to find it. The best you can hope, if you are a king trying not to slaughter your own people, is that you will exhaust the purse strings of those who pull them. The Lords Declarant found themselves not quite heroes of their own narrative when their best plans were cut with embarrassing poise by men and women who kept to the letter of the charter they had signed. The Hightower cousins began to avoid the hall because they did not enjoy watching their books read aloud. The fight came when it had to, on the water, as every struggle in the Reach does eventually. Hightower captains sent 3 ships up the Mander flying flags that said they were carrying religious relics and thus exempt from tolls. Davos, who had become something like a priest of practicalities, recognized the flags as the sort of lie that smells of dull wax. He stopped them at a bend in the river where reeds grew thick and birds watched with a kind of interest in human folly. The ships tried to push through without ramming him. He brought his long, low boat alongside and leapt to their deck with a cursing elegance that would have made any 7 blush. He found casks of olive oil, wax in the mouths of girls dyeing cloth in barn sheds while the men did business, and 2 chests of coin minted with a lion on one side and a star on the other. "Relics," he said, prying a lid off a chest with his knife, the coin bright inside and sickening. "And which of the 7 is this worship to be offered to? The smith to buy nails? The stranger to buy graves?" The captain, who was a cousin of a Hightower, thought it well to spit a prayer and draw a knife. Davos hit him with the flat of his blade, then had him in irons and the ship pulled into the shallows. The men from King's Landing cheered. The cousins called to the guards in the rushes. In a moment there were 100 men on both sides with wet boots and a sense of grievance. Brienne moved her foot along the bank as if to test the earth for honesty. "Hold," she said, and her guard held. The Hightower guard held too, which meant someone had told them not to be fools. The cousins had not heard that order and gave it instead. Swords came out like teeth, jaws clenched, and then Brienne was in the water wading hilt high, taking the captain with irons by the scruff and dragging him to the crown's side in a display of jurisdiction that paid in theater what it owed in law. The first arrow flew. It lodged in a wet plank. Both sides stared, startled by the smallness of it. Then men began to shout because shouting is something you do when the world fails the point you wanted to make. Jon came down the bank with Ghost loping ahead like Winter's own emissary. He did not draw Longclaw until his feet were in the water too. He held the sword up and caught the light and felt stupid because he was a king holding a sword at grown men who should have had better sense. Maybe that is a king's work, he thought grimly, to stand between bricks and the head that cannot help but hit them. A shadow passed, and for a second all sound was an intake of breath. He did not hear wings so much as feel the air push, the way it does when a storm stands up suddenly on the horizon. Men looked up because men always look up when they sense themselves small. It was not a cloud, and it was not a bird, and it was not a story. It slid over them, great and black and older than their maps. Davos swore in a whisper that didn't seem meant for any god any man had named. Brienne lifted her sword and then lowered it in awed surrender. Tyrion, coming over the rise with a shout half-formed in his mouth, stumbled and caught himself on a reed. Drogon. He came low out of the west, where a line of black on the horizon might have been storm or story in equal measure. He did not roar. His mouth did not open. He passed over the water and the reeds bowed as if wind were a king. He circled once in a wide arc that took in the men and the boats and the shouting and the soaked cloaks and Ghost standing with fur bristled and teeth bared in wonder more than threat. He hovered for a heartbeat, a blink of time that turned the world an old shade of fear. Then he turned, beat the sky with his vast wings, and was gone. A streak that made the river look like a piece of work in progress on a god's bench. No one moved. The water lapped. A duck quacked idiotically in a far clump of reeds, and somehow that was no blasphemy at all. Jon felt his breath return to him and looked at the men with swords half lowered. Their faces were washed clear of certain kinds of courage and left with others. "That," Davos said to the Hightower captain, "was a relic. They took the ships as seized under the law. They find men who could pay and put men who couldn't to work mending the very docks they had tried to cheat." The Lords Declarant sent huffy letters that read like old women's resentments and then came, one by one, to make public apologies because farmers along the Mander began muttering that kings who could command dragons without burning men might be better kept than taunted. Jon did not say that he had not commanded anything. He let them believe what made peace easier. He slept that night and saw her hair in the firelight and woke with his fist clenched around nothing and a salt taste on his tongue. The rest came down like spring rain. Fits and starts, drizzles, bursts. The charter spread. Priests memorized the parts that made their lives safer. Merchants learned how to quote certain clauses as protection. Children learned the lines that said kings must hear a commoner who cries harm. It was not justice. It was a wall that leaned the right way with enough of them leaning behind it. And men who had once served vicious kings learned to make their kindnesses look like crowns. Jon wrote to Sansa, and she wrote back, and sometimes he felt as if the letters were the only part of him that could believe in the future. She told him that the North had accepted his title because he had not tried to put it on them like a collar. She said the men would fight for him if he asked and would plant for him if he did not, and would do both if winter required both. She described a winter feast where the hall had been full of songs and a boy had asked if the king could be asked for a birthday. She wrote, "I told him a king could be asked for anything, but one should not be too surprised at disappointment. It is what keeps us honest." Arya's letter came again, thin and clever. She drew pictures on the corners of the parchment. Ships like knives, fish with angry eyes, a map sketched with more confidence than she might admit. "I'm going west and west until the stars look like strangers," she wrote, and a line under it. "I'll turn back if I taste a cliff at the edge. Then, smaller, I won't taste a cliff." Sometime after, Jon went north again, because the crown on his head did not have to mean the south in his bones. He stopped at White Harbor and broke bread with Lord Manderley, who had lost weight and kept his cunning. He stopped at Last Hearth and held a child born in a rebuilt hall while the mother cried because her mother had never thought to see such peace. He reached Winterfell in a snow that was gentle and patient and saw the old walls again like a man sees the shape of a prayer coming home. Sansa met him in the yard with a knife in her belt and a ledger under her arm. She hugged him briefly and then looked at him as if to catalog every injury and every softening. He kissed her hair and said nothing foolish. They sat in the solar with cider steaming and Ghost asleep in a window's light. Jon told her about the Reach and Hightower smiles and Drogon's shadow and boys who want to bind themselves to death because it seems noble. She told him about a harvest that needed hands and a river that needed dredging and a fight between Mormonts and Glovers that had resolved itself into a marriage no one had predicted. She told him about Bran, who had gone back to the Weirwoods and had said, before he left, that the old trees were quieter now, as if Inter had released a breath they had been holding for 1,000 years. "Do you still want to be done with it?" she asked softly, when words had made them brave enough to be quiet. "Every day," Jon said. "Will you be?" "No," Jon said, "but I will find ways to be less not done." Sansa smiled at that, a private thing like a candle behind her eyes. "I am making trouble of my own," she said. "A woman came to me from Skagos with a complaint about traders who think the island is a coin purse. I am going to settle it by sending a man who owes me a favor rather than a law. Do you approve?" "I approve of you," Jon said. "The rest is boxes to put our prayers in." When he returned south again, the face of the realm had changed so subtly that it took him a day to see it. In the markets, men argued with officials with less fear and more exasperation. In the Riverlands, messengers moved faster and paid less to nondescript men who had once stopped them for no reason but habit. In the Vale, Robin Arryn had stopped drinking too much wine at noon and begun taking hawks out at dawn, an improvement that Yohn Royce related with gruff satisfaction. In Dorne, the prince wrote a long letter about water rights that read like poetry and law woven together, which Sam adored and Tyrion pretended to despise while making notes. The Reach quieted, by degrees. Uther Hightower discovered that it is hard to organize a revolt when the man you are targeting does not call you a traitor but demands to see the list of the last 10 things you spent public money on. Lord Rowan dug a new mill rather than a new lie. The Fossaways began arguing about apple tariffs, which is a healthier argument. The High Septon declared that a marriage is a holy thing when it is a holy thing and otherwise a useful thing, which is the sort of confusion men can live with. Jon did not marry. He learned to attend feasts without opening his heart to offers that were really gambits. He learned to say no and mean it without being cruel. He learned to let Sam speak for him when a yes needed to become a piece of paper. He learned when to send Brienne and when to send Davos and when to write to Sansa and when to sit with Ghost with his fingers in the wolf's fur until his head was empty. He learned to live with absence. He learned to keep his sword clean and his boots clean and his promises clean, or as clean as the world would allow. He stood, once, at dusk in the little hall where he had made the compromise vows and looked at the cutting of the heart tree. It had read his time and decided to live. The leaves were broader now, the red deeper, as if it had learned to drink a city's light the way it drank winter sun. He reached out and put his fingers to a leaf and felt nothing but the coolness and the slight resistance of a living thing that had decided to take. He did not ask it for advice. He did not try to make legends out of what was a task. You look less like a boy who stumbled upon a crown and more like a man who set down a heavy bundle to argue prices, Tyrion said, coming in and standing beside him. This is meant to be a compliment. It almost was, Jon said. Almost is the best I can offer, Tyrion said, sighing. I have made an enemy of boredom by being a friend to it. Did I ever tell you that I dream sometimes of a house with a door that does not open to an interrogation? No? Consider yourself told. Also consider that Yara has sent word that some of her men have taken to trading with fishermen along the Cape and calling it a raid. She wants to know whether to dock their pay or their fingers. She is trying to sound humorous. She is not. Dock pay, Jon said. If they keep it up, dock their captains. Tyrion's quill hovered over the parchment. I'll tell her to dock the captains of their pride. She likes doing that. Oh, and Sam wants to write a book about the Long Night. He says he will call it A True History of the Cold and the Flame. I told him to consider a title people might finish. Tell him to write it anyway, Jon said. I will, Tyrion said. He hesitated. Do you regret it? Jon stared at the small tree that had decided to make a home in a place that had been all knives once. He thought of the dead in the snow. He thought of boys in robes with verses in their heads and their fingers on fire. He thought of Ygritte and Dany and the way Ghost's fur felt when he was too tired to do anything but live. No, he said. I regret parts of the price, but not what we bought. Tyrion nodded. He poured wine and was quiet for a time, which was a gift. From outside, the city brought him its noises. The creak of a cart, a hawker's call, a girl laughing, a dog barking, a wheel turning, a child crying and then being soothed. He knew none of these sounds would find a song, and he was grateful. They were the texture of what he had chosen. Years do what years do. The winter loosened. Summer was not as long as folk hoped, but long enough to repair. There were bad harvests and better ones. There were small wars pushed to small corners of maps and held there. The charter grew smudged at places where men's fingers rubbed it. Sam wrote a cleaned copy every year and had it read aloud on the hill where the September had been, which had become a habit small folk liked because it felt like a fair where no one asked them to spend coin. The crown minted coins with a wolf and a 7-pointed star on one side and a sprig of leaves on the other, and some people complained because change makes people complain and then use them to buy onions. Sansa married, not for the South's sake, not to bind any quarrel, but because a man of the North proved himself to her in the only way that matters up there. By standing when he could have run, by working when he could have slept, by keeping the fire when she was away. She did not become a queen. She did not need to. The men who wanted to fight her learned they would tire before she would. She had children with stark eyes, who learned to throw snowballs hard and to read the charter loud and to ride wolves with dignity, which is to say they did not ride wolves because wolves are not horses and dignity includes a knowledge of limits. Arya sailed and wrote letters that smelled of salt and spice and wet boards. She never found an edge to the world. She did find islands where people kept time by the hatching of birds and a coast where men built houses out of stones that sang in the wind and a place where the moon looked bigger, and she learned to love maps even when they were wrong. Once she sent a gift, a shell with a blue inside that looked like sky for the pocket. Jon kept it in a drawer with other things that were true and private. Brienne grew older and did not grow less formidable. She filled the 7th spot with a woman from the Riverlands who had saved 2 children from a burning barn and learned to kill a man only afterward. Podrick learned how to be noble in small ways that matter. Davos taught boys to tie knots who had once thought tying a knot meant binding someone's wrists. Yara ruled the Iron Islands with a spit-fierce cheer and threw men's boasts back into the sea when they bored her. The Prince of Dorne died and his sister took his place, because Dorne understands women and water better than the rest of the realm. She wrote letters that flirted with policy. Tyrion took a lover and lost her and took to keeping a garden whose vegetables surprised everyone. Sam's book took a decade and then another, and when it was finally done it was too long. And boys read the parts with swords and girls read the parts with names, and both learned something their parents had not known. Jon did not wed and did not make an heir. The realm accepted it because the realm had learned that not every question will be answered in the time a supper lasts. He wrote into the charter a clause for succession by council and signed it. The lords complained and then brought their own candidates in their hearts, and their words softened because they had begun to love stability like bread. He made Sansa's eldest the Warden of the North on his 17th name day with an oath that tasted of smoke and snow. He named a clever daughter of Lord Royce as Warden of the East and a boy from Fair Isle as Warden of the West and a shy Seaworth grandson as Master of Ships. He cultivated a habit of not overreaching. When he died, he wanted to leave a chair anyone could sit without bleeding. He did not command Drogon. The dragon flew sometimes, a shadow over markets, a rumor that made men look up. Once, in the heart of summer at dusk, Jon was told by a fisherman that he had seen the creature sleeping on a tall rock out at sea, and that the water had steamed there, and that the fish had given that place a wide berth for days and then returned because hunger is practical. Jon listened and said, "Thank you." He gave the man coin and did not look toward the west for more than he should. Some nights he dreamed the old dream of flame and a woman's hand and woke with Ghost's head on his chest and thought, "This is the same heart, and I will carry it until it stops." When he walked through the city years later, old enough that his beard had gone from black to salt with a handful of white at his lip, he saw the long results of small tired decisions. He saw women walk streets at dusk with baskets on their arms and without knives in their sleeves. He saw beggars who begged for the usual reasons and not because a captain had appointed them taxes they could not pay. He saw the little hall with the cutting grown tall enough to brush the lintel and new shoots sprouting because trees do that when men carry water. He saw Tyrion in a chair in a garden, asleep with a journal on his chest, and Brienne drilling a boy who swung a sword too low. He saw Sam with ink on his thumb and contentment on his face, and Davos with a grandchild on his knee telling him lies about honest men that were mostly true. He sat sometimes with Sansa when she came south in spring to remind herself that there was a world of stone and dust where flowers had to be coaxed rather than arriving through the snow. She sat with him and told him when he was a fool and when he was wise, and sometimes they simply sat with their shoulders touching, quiet in a way that would have made a younger Jon suspicious of silence. They did not speak of their father often. When they did, it was not to make him into a saint but to remind themselves that honor can be a knife you use to cut bread if you learned how. On a winter noon when the wind hurled sleet at the shutters and made the lanterns gutter, Jon climbed the rebuilt Tower of the Red Keep to a room that had walls thick enough to hold heat. He looked out over the city and its roofs mottled by winter's attempt to see itself reflected and thought about what had been given and what had been taken. Ghost lay with his head on his paws and watched him with eyes that had always seemed to know more than the humans in the room. "You remember," Jon said to the wolf, because he had learned that speaking made sense of the world even if no one answered. "You remember more than I do sometimes. The snow up at the wall. The smell of a camp where hungry people are angry at the sky. The heat on the back of your neck when a dragon looks at you. The feel of grass at Winterfell like a prayer." Ghost thumped his tail. That was answer enough. A knock came at the door. Brienne entered and stood with the ease of a woman who owns herself. She bowed because habit is a kind of armor and then smiled. "There's a child in the yard," she said. "He's born to a butcher and a woman who sells turnips. He wants to be a knight. He's 13 and holds a wooden sword like a rake. He asked to see the king. He says he has a question." Jon cocked his head. "A question?" Brienne's mouth tilted. "He wants to know whether the crown is a story, and if it is, whether he can be in it." Jon laughed softly, like an old man who has learned not to be ashamed of gentleness. "Bring him," he said. The boy came in with nervousness on his face and mud on his boots. He looked at John as if expecting a lion and seeing instead a man with tired eyes and a wolf at his feet. He gulped and looked at Brienne and then at Ghost and then managed to say, "Your Grace, my mother says I'm a fool. My father says I can be a fool if I bring meat home. I want to be a knight. They say I need a lord to speak for me. Can a butcher's boy be a knight?" "No," John said. He let the word sit. Brienne glanced at him but did not interrupt. The boy's face fell. John said, "A butcher's boy cannot. But a boy who learns to hold a sword like a sword and to use his hands for work and to keep to an oath when keeping it will make him late home. He can be a knight. But it's not the sword that makes it. It's what you do when no one watches. If you can do that, you will be asked by someone to kneel, and if it is me, I'll say yes. If it is Sir Brienne, she will say yes if you deserve it. If it is another lord, and he says no because your father sells meat, then come find me and I will teach him the charter." The boy stared. Then he grinned with the sudden and foolish and beautiful trust 13-year-olds can still afford. "Yes, Your Grace," he said, and then stronger, "Yes." He left, and Brienne shook her head in amusement. "You like making work for me," she said. "A boy with a wooden sword becomes my business." "It was always your business," John said. "You were a squire once. Somebody taught you. Now you turn into that person for somebody else, and the world moves. That's ruling, I think." "Yes," Brienne said simply, and if there was pride in it, it was clean. When snow came, it came as it always does. A curtain pulled slowly over a world that refuses to be fully quieted. John went north sometimes and stood in Winterfell's Godswood and once on the wall, where Windbit and Tormund laughed at him and said he had grown old in the soft air and might need reminding what cold meant. John ate stew with free folk and remembered the taste of the life he could have had by choosing differently and did not regret choosing as he had. Regret is a map to a place you cannot reach anymore. A man can still read the roads for interest. The last time he saw Drogon, he saw only the shadow and the ale in his belly and thought of her name without saying it. He had learned that saying names does not bring people back. The dead are not dogs. The shadow passed either above King's Landing or above the idea of it. He was too tired to tell. He looked up at the sky and then back at the paper in his hand, which he signed with a laborer's scrawl. He went to bed and slept a clean sleep. Years later, when they put him in the ground, quietly, without swords, with candles but no crown, they placed him in a place he had chosen. A small plot in the city where both gods could look with equal claim. His sister came and put a hand on the earth and said something only the earth needed to hear. Ghost lay with his head on the mound until someone coaxed him away with kindness and meat, and then he went north because wolves do. Men said many things afterward, with the easy lying that comes after someone cannot contradict you. They said he had been a Stark king who learned to stand in southern weather. They said he had been a dragon who had mastered his fire. They said he had written a charter that children learned in schoolrooms that still smelled of smoke, and that he had built a little shrine where a tree grew that should not have. None of that was the whole of it. No story is, not even the ones men write and bind and put on shelves. But the roads kept. The grain moved. Priests prayed and did not burn towers in cities where they were loved. The Hightowers learned to clap hands with wolves when music asked it. The Ironborn raided no one who did not need reminding to chain their harbor. In an inn in the Riverlands, a boy whose father had been a bandit hung up his sword and counted coppers at a table instead. A girl in Dorne learned law and the curvature of reeds and wrote a letter that saved a village from a flood. A boy in the Vale with weak lungs practiced hawking until he could run. A butcher's son held a real sword at last and wept as his father, who had once doubted, cried openly with pride because even butchers cry for right reasons and no one laughed. And beyond the far western sea, where the maps had once folded into ignorance, a ship cut a line on black water. A woman stood at the prow and watched stars that had learned to be strangers become friends. She thought of a brother whose blood had mingled winter and fire, of a sister who had made a house into a country, of a boy who had held a wooden sword like a rake and learned better. She thought of a direwolf white as an old song. She raised a hand to feel the wind's teeth and laughed and went on. Because what else is there when the story has decided to keep telling itself?